if you move back to Pasuk Tet in Perek Aleph, we start the story of Vashti. Now, the earlier part of the Perek, with the great banquets and feasts that existed at the time that Achashverosh threw, those feasts, according to Chazal, as you recall, were when he was basically declaring victory over God, saying that the 70 years had concluded of the exile, and look, the Jews have not been redeemed, and therefore it must mean that the Jews are no longer the favored nation of God, and that's the reason why they would bring out the kelim from the Beit HaMikdash. That's the reason, according to the Midrash, where he dressed in the big day Kehuna Gdolah, he thought of himself as replacing what had been. However, historians also suggest, and we find this also within the Chazal, that this was also military victories that took place. He threw these massive parties. The first parties, if you remember, he threw for the people who were outside of Shushan, and then the last 7 days he had Shushan. Seventh day of 180 days or 187 days, according to others, of these parties, he then calls Vashti before him. And the way he calls Vashti is a very strange manner. Pasuk Tet teaches, Gam Vashti Amalka Asata Mishte Nashim. She was making her own party for the women. We saw on the map where it was separated. It was on the southern portion of his palace compound versus the northern portion of the palace compound, where the great celebration that he had for the masses took place. Asher Melech Achashverosh. Bayom Hashvi, on the seventh day, Ketov Lev Hamelech Bayayin, when the king was happy through the wine. Now, obviously, Ketov Lev Hamelech Bayayin could simply mean that he was drunk. Okay, the other piece of it, Rav Yeshua Bachrach, who used to teach for many years at the Michlala, said that Ketov Lev Hamelech B'Yayin also goes back to a simple principle. What is the Megillah trying to teach us? It's the principle we find in Chazal, Nichnas Yayin Yatsa Sod, that when someone gets a little drunk, you really find out all of the secrets, that this was something that he always wanted to do. He always wanted to show off Vashti, and he never did it because it wasn't considered appropriate protocol. But now, when he's a little tipsy, it's something he's willing to do. Amar li muman bistach avona bigtav kata zeiter v'charkas shivata sarisim ha'meshartim epnei hamelech Achashverosh. He told these 7 leaders lahavi et Vashti hamalka lifnei hamelech becheter malchut, to bring Vashti before him. Now, one thing that we noted right away is that the way he is beckoning Vashti to come, if you want to extend honor to the queen, you don't send 7 guys to go ahead and call her. The king should have sent his own personal message, even if it was a written message that he sent biyad, but something. But instead he said, the 7 of you, go get her. Now, in his monarchy, explains Rabbeinu Bachayim, in his monarchy, bringing the queen to show her off in the time of the Persians was not something unheard of. It was obviously, if he's holding till the end, something extraordinarily special, but it wasn't unheard of. However, part of the issue is that according to Chazal, her coming from the Babylonian Empire, her being the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, this was not something that was done. So it was against her sensibilities, even though it was something that was within his, and it was done in the totally worst possible way that it could be done. You want to convince the queen to do something that's not in her tradition to do, that's not something she has done before. Don't send your 7 underlings to do it. Lavi et Vashti hamalka lifnei hamelech becheter malchutam in pasuk Yud Aleph laharot ha'amim v'asrim et yofya ki tovat marehi, to go ahead and show off her beauty. Now, even without Chazal's medrash that it was just with her crown and nothing else was she allowed to wear, even if she was supposed to be decked out in all of her royal clothing, there's no question that this is part of the way Achashverosh is trying to show his power and his importance and his honor by showing how beautiful his queen is. It isn't talking about her, it's more about him. And she refused. And the reason she refused, again, she didn't fit. Simple pshat, the Chochmei Tzfat say this, shegnaihu. okay, that this is not considered something proper for a woman to be the object of men's viewing. This wasn't something to be proper. Now, again, the Ralbag says, as I've mentioned before, she refused because of the way it was mentioned. And then Rashi quotes that famous medrash about that she had sarat, okay, or it could be that there were other issues that were going on with her, the tail, the other things of that nature we talked about before. But what's interesting, she refused to go. Asher biyadas arisim, vaytzov hamelech ma'od v'chamato ba'arabo. He became very, very upset. Now, what got him so very upset? Vaytzov, I get it, but why vaytzov ma'od? Now, very simply, the Gemara says, because it wasn't just, please tell the king that I have a headache, or please tell the king I don't want to go, but rather the message that she sent back to the king was a very insulting message back to the king, which caused it to really be something that he didn't want to deal with. And the Gemara in Megillah outlines this in Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet, and she says to him, and this is based on yet a medrash, that Achashverosh had actually served as one of the livery boys, one of the boys in the horse stables, a stable boy in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And what she sent back to him was, you, okay, who was one of the stable boys in my father's stables, couldn't be able to hold back this bit of drink that you had. My father could have had 1,000 cups of wine, and he wouldn't have behaved in this way. He wouldn't have gotten drunk. You have one, and look what happens to you. So she insulted him, according to the Gemara. But again, the Malbim says that ultimately what Achashverosh was trying to do was use her as an object to show how important he was, and even to show his legitimacy. Okay, he's following Vashti Malka, that what he wanted to do is he wanted to show her off, because specifically, Lahaviyat Vashti Malka, I want to show the queen. She had royal lineage. She was part of the reason that he had legitimacy, similar, if you remember, in the time of Herod, where he wanted to marry into the family of the Hasmoneans to be able to have the legitimacy of his rule as well. But because of all of this, he became incensed with it. Now, yeah, please.
Why does Rashi have to go so far and bring down the medrash about her changed body? Like it's just such a strange.
Rashi, in terms of the changed body, because what Rashi is picking up on, Becheter Malchut in the previous pasuk, that he goes and he says, I want her to come just Beketer Malchut and nothing else. Now, given those days, perhaps, Beketer Malchut and nothing else wasn't so outlandish. Think of the belly dancers and everything else. But if there was some other reason why she wouldn't want to come. So the Gemara picks up on that other reason, Chabat Sarat, and also saying that all of this, if you remember, Bayom HaShvi was Shabbat, and all of this was a punishment that she was being punished all at the same time. Rashi's following all this approach in the Medrash.
But a tail?
A tail is an alternative. A tail is an alternative.
What's the need?
What's the point of both of them being things that would be embarrassing to appear in public with? That's all. I don't know too many people who'd want to show in public with sarat, or would show in public with a tail. Okay, the tail is another piece of the medrash as well, that it's animalistic, and we can go on all sorts of drashot with it as well. It has to be, the medrash is looking for some additional reason why she wouldn't have come. And that's the pieces. So some will say it's enough that she was just coming becheter malchut. Some will just say it's enough that she was coming even if she was fully clothed, right? That's according, there would seem to be the Malbim's approach. Some would go ahead and say it's enough if she was just coming just beketer malchut. Says even that wouldn't be enough. She needs some other additional reasoning, and there's a machloket of what that additional reason was. That's all. Now, this chamato, if you remember, chamato v'arabo, though, is the reason why we have to, the Vilna Gaon points this out, is the reason why we're looking for some additional reason. Just a refusal should incense him to such an extent, unless this challenges legitimacy, unless there was something very sharp that she sent back to him, and that opens it all. Vayomer Hamelech lechachamim yodei ha'itim. And so now the king turns to his advisors, yodei ha'itim. Now, yodei ha'itim, according to Rashi, just this is the way he goes. He's going to his advisors themselves. The interesting thing is the Vilna Gaon points out that he's doing this because this is protocol, that when it comes to matters of others, the king is allowed to make a decision on his own. When it comes to matters of himself, the rule is that anything involves his family, he has to turn to the necessary advisors because he is nogeh b'davar. He has personal stake in this. And so therefore he has to turn to the Yodei team. The Chizkuni says, no, this is one more time where we see that Achashverosh just can't manage things himself. He's turning to somebody else again. Something that should have been manageable by a real king, he couldn't do. Now, the Gemara takes, though, a very interesting idea, and the Gemara says that this was actually, he turned to the Chachamim, he turned to the Jewish advisors, Yodei Ha'itim, those who knew times, those who knew how to calculate the months, those who knew how to take the astronomy of the world, those were the Chachamim, and they found themselves in a terrible problem because they knew that if they went ahead and they gave them any kind of answer possible, that what would end up happening, no matter what they said, they would be in further trouble. And because this is the normal way. Now, again, the Abarbanel says the Ibn Ezra says they just turned to the people who knew how to calculate times. It wasn't Chazal, they just turned to advisors. Vakarov elav. However, this is now a parenthetical comment. He turned to this group of advisors, and then we say, wait a second, closest to him at that moment were Karshana, Sheter, Admatad, Tarshish, Merish, Mersanam, Memuchan. Shivat Sarem Parasu Madai, Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech Yoshvim Rishona b'Malchut. These are the people who were sitting closest to the king. In other words, they were his internal cabinet. Who were there? The 7 of them were all sitting there, and they were already there at that point. According to the Gemara, Memuchan is Haman. According to the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, another Tannaitic work, Memuchan is Daniel. So we don't really know, this tradition. Often when we're learning this Megillat Esther, people say, oh, you see, Haman is here. No, Haman is not there. Memuchan is there. Why would Chazal tie Memuchan with Haman? And that is because it ultimately puts it all together. And this, the Ibn Ezra says, it's perhaps a tradition because if Memuchan is Haman, then it's just a magnifying the wonders of this story, that the very person who was responsible for the downfall of Vashti and ultimately the arrival of Esther was going to be Haman himself. So we see the Yad Hashem in all of this, and this is the way that the Ibn Ezra deals with this, that it was all done, God working behind the scenes. Now, the other piece of it, and we'll see in just a moment, Memuchan is going to be the one who's speaking, they're listed in the order of their prominence, and this was important to Chazal, that this is the way we're going to see it. Alita, you got a question?
Yeah, I think it's a little weird that this guy, Memuchan, could be either Haman or Daniel. I mean, they're like two opposites.
Right. So again, it's not the pshat. It's a medrash that's built up on this. And the reason for this medrash being built up is we have two competing factors. So the Ibn Ezra is one I mentioned already. Okay. We're showing the Yad Hashem. Memuchan, because we know from Sefer Daniel that he was one of the trusted advisors. And his name's not here. And so Chazal were looking to connect what we had learned in Sefer Daniel to what we're seeing is the reality in the court of Achashverosh. And where is Daniel in this story? And that's why we're finding him here in Memuchan. It's what's interesting in the story, if the story just has Memuchan as Memuchan, it doesn't change the miraculousness of the story. If the story has Memuchan as Daniel, it doesn't change the miraculousness of the story. If it has Memuchan as Haman, there's there is a little bit more to it that you can build into it. But there are other challenges as well, because why are we calling a person whose character we're going to know him later on, and just very shortly, is Haman? Why are we calling him Memuchan? Why does he have another name within the court? And all 7 of these are sitting, Kedat Malasot b'Malka Vashti, and they want to know what to do with this Queen Vashti. Through the fact that she did not do what the king had said via the Sarisim, via these officers, these ministers that he had. One more time, in other words, we've talked about this, that we say that she refused because it wasn't even protocol, the way he was sending them. Now we're emphasizing it. Jonathan Grossman, in his work on Esther, says this very clearly. This is mocking him. The Baal Megillah is mocking him. Et Mamar HaMelech Achashverosh could have been the end of the sentence. The decree of the king of Achashverosh could have been it. Why do we want to emphasize Biyad HaSarisim? To show how foolish he was in sending that command over to her that way. Vayomer Memuchan Lifnei HaMelech VaSarim. And so Memuchan steps up and he begins to speak. Again, the Gemara says that there is a saying, Mikan Ahediot Kofetz Barosh, that the simplest of all are the ones who are willing to give their opinion first. The very wise people normally sit back and listen and try to take everything in. The people who are not as wise, they jump in right away. Now we'll see politically, Memuchan was extraordinarily wise. But here he is the last on the list, and we're assuming the last on the list is the least of the list as well, and he jumps into the fray right away, and he says, "Lo al hamelech levado Vashti hamalka ki al kol asari val kol hamim asher b'chol medinot hamelech Achashverosh." And he says very clearly, "Listen, you need to understand this wasn't something against you, Achashverosh. This is a much bigger issue." Now, here's the problem: these 7 people are sitting there in front of Achashverosh, and what they're saying is to themselves, "This king is having an issue with his wife. He's having an issue with his wife. Invite her out for coffee. Have a conversation with his wife. What are we going to say? Anything we say to insert ourselves in this relationship, we're going to lose." Says Memuchan, not if I make this no longer about an issue between a husband and wife, between the king and queen. I'm making this an issue that's affecting the entire world itself. Look at the number of times the word kol appears. In this sequence, the word kol appears 7 times. It becomes the milah mancha, becomes that guiding word to say this is bigger. It affects everything. And therefore, it's not just about the king, but rather it's about everyone, all of the Sarim, all of the countries, what just happened. You're watching a problem that if you don't take control of it now, is going to be an international problem. Ki yetzei dvar hamelech al kol hanashim lavzot balehem beinehem, bo'omram hamelech Achashverosh amar lavi et Vashti hamalka lefanav v'lo va. Because if you go ahead, there's going to be this word that goes out, that just like Vashti exhibited her own power and refused to come before the king, every wife can do the exact same thing. It's going to create this international problem of husbands and wives. We can't let it go. And therefore, what he says is, we need to take immediate action. Now, Memuchan is brilliant. He expands this as an international challenge that's occurring, and he says, don't even think about it. Right now, send it out to all of the officers of Paras Umadai Shamu Dvar HaMalka who heard what happened. So you don't want to miss it. Anyone who was sitting there, says the Reed Nachmiyash, that anyone who's sitting there, make sure they hear this new decree, because you have to undo it before it gets out there. And that you go ahead, kedai is die, enough. Okay, because there is so much bizayon and katzef that's associated with this. Notice, by Sof HaMelech, we said before, HaMelech Achashverosh, when he got angry, and now we have the katzef. We have the same word playing on itself again. Imala Melech Tov. And now comes the exact suggestion. Memuchan is still speaking. And this should be written in the annals of in the laws of Parasu Madai, and it cannot be violated. Asher lo tavo Vashti lifnei hamelech Achashverosh u'malchuta yiten hamelech leruta tova mimena. That she should no longer come, that Vashti should no longer come before Hamelech Achashverosh, and her position should be given to someone else. Now, Chazal take this, and they say that, oh, this is the decree to kill Vashti. The only problem is, it doesn't say that. It says she should not be allowed to come before the king. Now, we could understand it as a euphemism, but the Chachmei Tzarfat say no, that anyone who says that Vashti was killed is making a mistake. Because if it says this, v'lo tibatel, which we'll see in a moment, that this should never be annulled, what it's saying is this is going to be a punishment she's going to have that can never be revoked. She's going to be banished from ever coming before the king. We don't see it clearly that she's going to be killed. The Dat Mikra says that ultimately, if you think about it, this is midah keneged midah. She didn't want to come. Now she'll never be allowed to come. And that's his proposal. Vanishma pitgam hamelech asher yaseh b'chol malchuto, and we have to make sure that these words are heard in all of his monarchy. Ki rabai v'chol anashim yitnu yakar levalehem lemigadol ve'ad katan. And we have to make sure that women are going to give honor to their husbands, no matter their status, whether they're great or they're small. Yakar is a word. Okay, vikar at the end of the Megillah, we have it again. The idea of kavod. Now think about it. From Achashverosh's position, what was the insult? The insult was she didn't give him the honor and the glory that he sought. So now Memuchan makes it national, says we got to make sure that such a thing doesn't happen. We have to nip it in the bud. It has to be taking place now, not just when it's a big insult, but even with a little one, even with an unimportant person. Vayitav hadavar b'nei hamelech v'hasarim. And this was found favor in the eyes of the king and the ministers. Why are the ministers in here? I understand that Achashverosh asking Memuchan for his advice. Memuchan gives his advice. I get it. The king likes the advice. But why the Sarim? Because the Sarim ultimately were on the spot. Achashverosh had turned to them. They wanted the advice. And they didn't know what to say. And little Memuchan comes up with this Machiavellian plot that's brilliant, that gives Achashverosh an out. If someone says to Achashverosh, how could you do, and especially according to Chazal where she was killed, how could you punish her so severely? How could you remove her from the monarchy? How could you do all these things? He could say, I did this not because of me. I did this for the goodness and the safety of the entire kingdom. What she did was dangerous to everybody. And so I'm just looking out for your good, not for my good. It's not about me. It's about everybody. And the Sarim are thrilled with it at the same time because they're off the hook. Vayas HaMelech Kidvar Memuchan. And he followed the advice of Memuchan. Now, Vayas HaMelech Kidvar Memuchan, to go back to Alita's question, his following Memuchan, later in the Megillah, we're going to have the issue that he's following the advice of Haman. Right? So Vayas HaMelech Kidvar Memuchan. Well, if you just place it, you'll see that same phrase elsewhere. One of the other reasons why Chazal would also attach Memuchan with Haman. Vayishlach Svarim el kol medinot hamelech el medina u'medina kichtava ve'el am va'am kilshono. And so they sent this out to all of the kingdoms or all of the countries within this kingdom, the 127 medinot, whatever those medinot mean, but to all of those different people, given all of those different people that they had to be in different languages, they had to be in different fonts and different scripts. Everything was sent out so it was clear. Liot kol ish sorer beveito medaber kilshonamo. That every man should be ruling over his household And it should be done kilshon amon. Now, ruling over the household again, this is talking about, why is this the closing phrase of this parak? And I'm told everyone we're going to finish a little early today. It's closing the parak for the reason, because that too was one of the themes. Achashverosh wanted to rule. Achashverosh wanted honor and glory. Vashti denied it of him. Achashverosh, as a result, followed the punishment because it was presented that this punishment and this decree about wives in their husbands' homes will bring honor and glory, what Vashti had denied, and will put in a position who rules over the roost, who's in charge. So it's so rare. But what's Kilshon Amo? Kilshon Amo is a phrase that's very complicated. It's according to the language of their nation. And so the Ibn Ezra and others take the opinion that this actually was a decree that wives had to start speaking the language of their husbands. That when we're dealing with these countries, that there were wives who spoke other languages. And this was actually saying enough. The wives have to acculturate to the culture of the husband. Think back now to Vashti and Achashverosh, according to that position that we took, which was in the Ibn Ezra, the Abarbanel, in the Ibn Ezra, which says that Achashverosh's culture was that it wasn't inappropriate to show off the queen. Vashti's culture was, the Babylonian culture, that this was not something that was done. So here the final decree is the wives have to acculturate to the practices of their husband. They have to follow this. Again, undoing part of what they thought was the evil that took place in Achashverosh's house. This is the end of the first parak, but what we have to remember, this first parak, except for the ways that Chazal tried to connect it, like mentioning that Haman is here perhaps, except for that, the first parak really seems almost unnecessary to the entire Megillah. If you think about it for a minute, we could start the Megillah, we could start it a few psukim later. We could just say, there was a queen, the queen is out, king's looking for a new queen, he picks Hadassah, Esther, and now we start the Purim story. Why do we have this first parak as part of the Megillah? So again, Chazal try to connect it. They connect it by bringing Haman in here. They try to connect it by having Achashverosh throwing the party because he miscalculated of when the Geulah, when the redemption ultimately was going to come and Jews were supposed to go back. We have it with the Kelim Shonim, with the Klei Beit HaMikdash. We have it with the Big Day Kuna Gdolah. We do have connections that they're trying to make. And yet, the reason for this could be on two levels. Level number one is just to build up the background so we understand what kind of king we're dealing with. This is a king who is into his own personal glory, who wants to make sure that he's accepted by others. Now, when somebody wants to be accepted by others, they are susceptible to influences from the outside because the person's going to say, if I don't do this way, they won't like me. It's only a person who's self-assured who's going to stand up for what's right, even if people disagree with them. So one is we're setting up the story. That's the easy way to understand it. But also what, and Margaret remembers him, Gabi Cohn, who used to be the head of Mechon Gold many, many years ago, Gabriel Cohn, and he is now a professor, I think he's retired at Bar Ilan University. In his sefer about Megillat Esther, what he talks about is we're trying to establish the nature of the Persian monarchy. The Persian monarchy was a materialistic monarchy. It is a monarchy that 20 times, as I mentioned last week, in this sefer, we talk about a mishteh. We talk about some kind of party. There's only 26 times in all of Tanakh the word mishteh is used. 20 of them are Megillat Esther. We want to talk about the materialism of Achashverosh and of the Persian Empire. And once we understand that, we also understand the motivator. It's not about the honor and it's not about the power. It's about the materialism, about what you get and what you have. And so if you remember later in the Megillah, first Haman And then later Mordechai, we're talking about the riches that will be accrued to the king that happen along the way. The way we end the Megillah is this very strange phrase that Achashverosh levied a tax over all the over all the outlying islands that he had control over. There were taxes that were put in. It's the idea of chumranut, of the idea of materialism and hedonism. That's very, very important for us to realize, and that's the first parak. See, the first parak is teaching us about Achashverosh in particular, or it's teaching us about the Persian Empire in general. And with that, we're going to stop, and I know it's early. Next week, we'll pick up at the regular time, and we'll fulfill the regular full time as well with Parak Bet.